Thank you for joining us this evening for Anchored. This is take number 4 of the evening. A big improvement, though. Would you agree, Brian,
Yes,
from last week?
yeah, very much so.
Just for our listeners.
We've only been 2 hours.
Yeah. Last week, it took me around 15 times. This week, just 4. But we are glad you chose to join us this evening, as crazy as we can get sometimes. But we do have a very interesting topic to discuss tonight. This is one that may actually go into 2 parts or 3, or who knows how far we may get with it, because it's so vast. And that's God's sovereignty. And when I think of God's sovereignty, Brian, I think of God being in control of my life. God being in control not just of my life, but of everything.
Yeah, it's interesting because probably by and large, when people define God's sovereignty, we'll define it this way, God being all-powerful, which is a very true statement, but that really doesn't adequately define His sovereignty. Because you're right, when we talk about God's sovereignty, we're talking about Him being in control of everything, which means that He exercises His will in regards to every situation and every aspect in life. And that's a hard concept for people to wrap their minds around, and definitely a hard concept for a lot of people to embrace.
Yeah, I can see that. And because I know of, and I'm not going to say in particular, of several individuals that will, talk about God's sovereignty, but they really don't have that understanding of what it really is, of how vast it is, and the implications of God's sovereignty. But I can think of an example, and I was talking to you about this earlier. When I was in school at KCU, not a whole lot of people know about this. I had every intention of leaving leaving there and actually going to Moorhead at least 2 times, and everything was set to go. It just never worked out. It never worked out, and I got frustrated at the time. But looking back, I see God's hand in it. But at that time, I didn't. And I think that's kind of where a lot of people are, especially in our spiritual life. We don't really, it's something that I think that takes time to learn.
Well, I think a lot of people, whether they realize it or not, have a deist mentality. And when I mean, you know what a deist is? A deist is someone who believes that there is a God, and that God created, and that God placed us here on this planet, and just kind of removed Himself, stood back, and let things go. And when the time is needed, He intervenes. But by and large, it's just a matter of kind of a roll the dice, and let's see what happens. And when He is needed, He will intervene. That really, on a very in the very simplest form, is a deist mentality. But that's not what the Bible teaches. We are not deists, and God is not some a great entity back here that's standing back watching us, just waiting to intervene. I believe that the Bible teaches that He is actively involved in every aspect of this world, in every aspect of our life. That's sovereignty.
Tell us and tell me, how important is it for the child of God to have a clear understanding of God's sovereignty?
Well, it changes a person's perspective on everything. I mean, you think about it just a second. Of everything that transpires in our life, of everything that we face, when we have that theology, when we have that understanding that God is sovereign, how you approach things changes. When you are grounded and certain that God is, and I love the term that's used, in control. No matter, and here's the thing, it's a belief that no matter what happens, no matter what direction that life takes me, no matter my experience, no matter the circumstance, God is in control. And it changes your perspective of everything. And it changes your approach to everything.
And I can say a big amen to that, especially from my life looking back, of how God's hand was in every area that, at the time I never thought a thing about it.
Well, you and I have had a lot of discussions over God's sovereignty, especially And and we talked about this too. The fact that your move to the church that you're in now, that was a sovereign act of God was at work. And there's a lot of things that transpired that we certainly won't go into here. But looking back, both of us agree it is one of those situations where you're like, my goodness,
Yeah.
how did he do that? How did I get from here to here, from point A to point B? And it was God at work, and it was interesting how he did it.
I know, it was very, very interesting. Who knows that Little League even could have connected that,
Yeah. Just to kind of put a little perspective on it, Little League did have God used Little League, believe it or not, to bring us together.
And just for the listeners, I only coached Little League that one time. That was the one and only time I've coached Little League.
Yeah.
And God led me to Horton Flats. He knew what I needed when I needed it. And, He worked it out for His glory and for His purposes. And I think a lot of people really do, like you said earlier, they have a hard time wrapping their mind around the idea of God being that in control of things. Especially when we get to talking about bad things.
Yeah.
Bad things happening,
Yeah.
Around us. That's when people get real uncomfortable. It's like, God is in control. Well, why does this happen?
Yeah. We'll all deal with it when difficult things happen, when bad things happen in our life or around us. We have a difficult time coming to the point of saying, because from a pastoral counseling, and this as a counselor, you're taught that in counseling with people, you never approach them from the perspective of, well, this is God's will. This is God's will. You never, in other words, when something terrible or traumatic happens to a person, it's not appropriate so that we're taught to, tell someone this was God's will. And I understand that, because people in their spiritual growth and maybe in a traumatic situation aren't ready. But the reality is, if we believe in the sovereignty of God, it is God's will. There are times when God allows things to transpire in our lives, allows things to touch our life for a specific reason. It's coming to the point of being able to embrace that and say, I may not understand it, but I trust it. That's God's sovereignty. Realizing that in all things, no matter what it is, He is sovereign. You see that all through the Bible. When I think about that, I think about the story of Joseph. And how if you go back and read how that his brothers the contempt they had for him, and they sold him into that band of marauders, and he ended up in Egypt, and he spent all of that time in Egypt. Basically his adult life, he was imprisoned, finally becoming a prince in Egypt, and then after all of those years, just to kind of shorten the story, when the famine hit. And he met with his brothers again, and when they finally saw who he was, do you remember what he said to them? And you can paraphrase here. I've paraphrased everything.
My initial reaction when you get to that point, you want to have a fill in the blank that Joseph got revenge.
Yeah.
That Joseph said this, but he didn't. He forgave them.
And why? But why did he forgive them?
And he basically, I'm paraphrasing, says that God intended this.
Yeah.
For His good.
Yeah.
That God worked that situation out.
If you go to the story of Job, and the Bible says how that Job was an upright man and he eschewed evil, or in other words, that he was a person who distanced himself from sin. He was an upright individual. That's what the Bible says about him. That's what God said about him. That's what God told Satan about him. And then he removed his hand, and in the life of Job, he said to Satan, you can go this far and no farther. And of course we know all of the calamities that hit in Job's life and all of the difficulties and the struggles, and yet you cannot read the story of Job and not see the sovereignty of God. Job was in the predicament, in the situation, and he endured all that because God allowed it to happen. And he did it, if you look at what happened to him, he lost his vocation, he lost his materials, he lost his children. You know, he basically had his life turned completely upside down and lost so much. And it wasn't an accident.
Right, and he never did curse God.
He never did curse God. But, did he understand all of it?
Probably not.
No, he didn't.
No.
If you read he did not. But if we say that God is sovereign, if we believe that God is sovereign, then we have to believe that everything that takes place in our life, both good and bad, and indifferent. You know, I believe that the Bible teaches Jesus himself. A bird doesn't even fall from the sky without God's say-so. You know, in other words, death can't come to a bird unless it gets past God first.
Right. It's like me driving down the road on the interstate in the ice, and I actually said to myself, well, I can't die unless it's time, and if it's time, it's time. And the funny thing what Jesus said about no bird falls out of the sky. Driving down the road several times on the way to church, and you know how it is back in the country, deer cross the road, and everybody at church knows that sometimes I can be a little bit running behind. But yeah, he laughs because he knows it's true. But there was this one particular time that like these 4 or 5 deer ran out in front of mine and Liz's car up the road, and you know, had we been on time, those deer would have still crossed that road at that time. I mean, I really honestly believe that God is that much in control. Myself, I believe that he is that much in control, and that those deer were going to do that at that exact time on that day.
But you know, there are a great many people, professing Christians, who would say, you know, that's taken a little bit far, don't you think? God being that much in control. But again, when you get deeper and deeper in the idea of sovereignty, there can be no other conclusion. I mean, the Bible, the sovereignty of God is all over the Bible. You look at when Joshua, when they went into Jericho. You remember what happened before they crossed the Jordan into the Promised Land. You remember what happened? He sent out spies, just as Moses did. But he sent out spies into the city of Jericho because that was the first place that they were directed to go. That was the first city they were going to meet when they crossed the river. He sent out the spies, and guess who they met, those spies? A prostitute named Rahab. Is it chance? Is it chance that when finally they did go in and destroy that city, and they destroyed men, women, every living thing in that city, except for Rahab and her family, they were the only ones that survived. And of course, we know what ultimately came of that. You know, it moves you right into the story of Ruth, and how that Naomi and her husband and their sons, you know, left Israel and went to the land of the Moabites, and there her husband died, and her sons died, and she had these 2 daughter-in-laws that were left, and you know, one of them came back with her, whose name was Ruth, who just by chance went gleaning into these fields and met with Boaz, and guess who Boaz was a descendant of? Rahab the prostitute. Is all that chance?
No.
You know,
oh goodness, no, it doesn't. And when you look at it in the terms of when you actually look at the Bible and you see that take place, like you said, it speaks of God's sovereignty.
Yeah.
And even look at the apostles, what they had to endure. I know for a fact that they maybe not fully understood, but that they acknowledged God's sovereignty for what they had to go through. They had to have. And it gets me to thinking, you know, and I've got several questions that's running through my mind, and I'm just trying to get them all straight here.
Well, that's why we'll do more than one part, but yeah, go ahead.
For example, for our identity as a child of God, having a clear understanding of God's sovereignty, do you think that shows in our life as our walk as a child of God?
Oh, definitely. Again, because it not only has a dramatic effect and a definite effect on your perception, but also your approach. Well, let me give you just an example in my life. You know, when my oldest son was diagnosed with cancer, that was a difficult time, an extremely difficult time. I wouldn't wish that on anybody. Wouldn't want to relive that again. But the question is that, was it an accident? now you're getting into some very personal area. Now it's hitting home. But even now, looking back at that and how God worked in that, how God sustained us, how He exercised His will, and the miracles He performed well beyond and outside of that cancer and outside of the box there, and the things He did. He used that in many ways.
And I could see how that's hard for some people to get that.
It reaffirmed to Kim and I. And I saw her grow more in that through that situation than any other thing during all of our years together. Realizing, because she saw it. I mean, it was before our very eyes, watching God at work and seeing how that, even before we got the diagnosis, God was putting the pieces together, setting the foundation before Tyler was ever sick. We didn't see that until looking back. And I won't go into specifics, but I can just tell you from a personal experience that I had one of Tyler's oncologists sit down with me one day, and he asked me the question. Tyler was having chemotherapy that day, and of course he was all hooked up and playing video games, and so his oncologist, we just had a conversation, and he asked me, he said, I want to ask you a question. He said, I see you and Tyler and Kim, your wife, come in. He said, I know you guys know how serious this is, and I know you're educated people, and it's not that you are in denial or anything like that. I know because we've talked about it. But he said, and yet, how are you guys so, you come in smiling, you come in upbeat, you come in, how do you do that? And it really gave me the opportunity not just to reflect at that moment, but also to share with him about God's sovereignty. Either God is who He says He is, or He's not. And whatever, I believe that God is sovereign, that He is in control, and that everything that happens is not a mistake. I don't believe in chance. I don't believe in random. I believe if you pull back the veil and the levels of everything, you will get to God's sovereignty. He is in control. And so in that particular situation, in that circumstance in our life, it definitely had an effect on our approach. And yourself that our approach to that, God used to have an effect on people's lives who were watching us.
Absolutely.
And I'm not saying that in a boastful manner. I'm not.
No.
And I don't want to downplay and act like that was just like we were just skipping through the rose garden during that time. It was a difficult, challenging time, physically, emotionally, spiritually. But the very foundation of our approach was God's in control. This is not an accident. We may not understand it. We may not even agree with it. There are moments in this life that if we could avoid, we would, but we can't avoid them. They take us by surprise, but they don't take God by surprise. And we had a theme we kind of reached for and put our arms around during that entire time. As a matter of fact, there's a plaque in our TV room with these words on it, and we constantly reminded ourselves of this. It says, "Fear not tomorrow, God is already there." I believe that with all of my heart. That is God's sovereignty.
And that's so awesome to know what you just said, that fear not tomorrow, God is already there. I mean, the hope that we can have in that, the confidence that we can have in the Lord in that is just awesome. And I like how just hearing you talk about that, what I was going to say is, Kim in particular, your wife, one thing that she said to me, of course on Facebook you get all the pictures of everybody's child and baby and what they're doing, and how you'll hear someone say how sad they are to see them grow up so quick.
Yeah.
I absolutely,
you won't hear her say that.
No, and I love what she says, and I think our listeners need to just hear kind of how her approach is on that. Could you just tell them what she says?
Yeah, when people talk about in not to say this is wrong, but that situation changed our perspective. But you will hear people who will talk about when their children are, they'll go from each phase. They're not little babies anymore, and they're not preschool, and they get to the high school, the teenage years, they kind of want to distance themselves, and people are saddened by that, and my wife, when people make statements like that to her, she's like, I will never be sad about my child or my children growing up, because we know what it feels like to be uncertain. I mean, Tyler was stage 4. He had been diagnosed with stage 4 cancer, and as she has said, here you got a 11-year-old looking death straight in the eye. We had no idea for a very long time which direction it was going to go. This kid went through very intense chemotherapy. I mean, it was just a year. Now you look back and it's kind of a blur. No, she doesn't.
I love how
she loves, she celebrates the fact that he's getting older. She celebrates the fact that he's a teenager who really doesn't want to have all that much to do with mom and dad now.
And that just shows you God's hand. God's how He works in your all's life, how He's worked in that situation. I think it's awesome to hear that. And I want to share that because not a whole lot of people know that, and it's just one thing that I've caught from you all that I really liked her approach on. And one of the last things maybe we could discuss, because there are several more questions that I've got in my mind, but why do people have such a hard time with this? Why do people have such, almost as if they kind of want to fight the fact that God is in that much control, or they seem to completely just want to ignore the fact?
Well, it certainly is in our nature. We all do. We have a rebellious nature. We have a nature that wants to be wants to be in control. Humanity from the very start. Adam and Eve proved that in the garden, and that's been consistently the case throughout biblical history. We see it over and over and over again, and we've done studies, and I'm doing one right now on Wednesday night. How to watch the nature of humanity. So it has to do with I think with our nature, first of all, not wanting to relinquish control, not wanting to concede that there are things that happen that's beyond our comprehension and understanding. That when you look out into the world and you see some of the things that are going on, and you see some of the tragedy that takes place, it's hard to and I agree, it's hard to say God's in control, when to look at the world it would appear that the opposite is true.
Right.
And I think that's what, when tragedy strikes, it's easier for us, I think, to think that, well, this was just a mishap, or and it's hard to get to the point, very difficult to say nothing escapes God, that He is actively involved in everything. Even going back to the story of Job, a person can look at what happened with Job and say, God didn't do that, Satan did that. Yeah, but God said to Satan, this far and no farther.
Right.
He even told Satan, you can do all of this, but you cannot take his life. My point is that at some level, from some angle, in every angle, God is sovereign. Nothing touches us. Nothing touches our life. Nothing happens until it first passes through the hand of God to us. People will say to me, but what about the loss of someone's loss of a child in some tragic accident? And I understand those kind of statements, but my answer to that is, Yeah, but what about that same type of accident over here that this child, was rescued? You see what I'm saying? I mean, it's hard for us. It's easy for us to embrace it in one direction, but hard for us to concede in another direction. When we talk about God's sovereignty in everything, it's in everything. Everything.
Yeah. I think this is a good point to stop for a moment, because there's so much more that we can get into with this. And one thing that I think that we should focus on next week for our listeners is specifically looking at the child of God, how God's sovereignty plays in their life as far as their relationship with the Lord.
Salvation.
Salvation, that's what I'm getting at,
Yeah.
Is looking at His sovereignty with salvation. And I think that our listeners really, I want to share that with them. I think that the Lord would have something for them in that.
And I can say this, I fought this for a very long time, to be honest with you. The idea God didn't control it. I did. I fought it for a very long time. But I realized that things just didn't add up if God wasn't sovereign. And once I just came to the point where I believe the Bible, I recognized, listen, the sovereignty of God is all over this from start to finish, which, with people like the Apostle Paul, or Saul of Tarsus, which is, if we're going to talk about his sovereignty in regards to salvation, we're definitely going to talk about
absolutely,
and some things that he had to say. But when I come to the point where I just conceded to God, it is true, you are sovereign. That perspective that I talked about changed, and everything started to make sense. The story of Job makes sense. The story of Joseph makes sense.
It's like put on a pair of glasses.
Yeah. The story of Jonah makes sense.
Yeah.
I mean, everything. And so, I think this is a huge topic, but it's one that is needed, especially in the world in which we are living, in the times in which we are living, because it's going to get more difficult, and we're already seeing it. Mm-hmm. It's becoming more difficult for Christians to live in this world. It's more of a struggle. That too is not an accident. But and so I think it's a critical issue that people need to consider.
Yes, I absolutely agree. Well, I hope you enjoyed our discussion tonight. If you have any questions, feel free to email us. You can find that on our website. Please just take the time, if you're just surfing, just to kind of see what our church is about. If you don't have a home church, we would like for you to consider coming out and visiting us sometime. We're a loving church, genuine people, love to have you. But we'll see you again next week for a continued discussion on God's sovereignty.